Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again tonight. It's a Wednesday night, and we are at your doorstep. Ginger the Voice, once again knocking on your doorstep. Welcome, ladies. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ginger at your doorstep once again tonight, talking all things heritage. If you can see our video or the profile, please like our video or like our page or say something. A hello is good enough, or just wave to us or like our video. Thank you so much for joining in tonight. We can see you liking our video. Thank you so much. Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are live here at Ginger the Voice, Facebook once again, to say to you, to give to you information and to have conversation with you tonight. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Ginger the Voice at your doorstep. We'll just give it a few seconds just to allow our viewers to come through. We do know that sometimes the network can be a bit of a problem, but thank you so much. We can see you liking our video. Thank you so much. We can see you giving us a comment. We're waving back at you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming through. Today we are talking about heritage and culture in the African context. It's an exciting conversation that we're going to have, and we've got exciting guests who've got in-depth knowledge on heritage and culture. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our tonight's show, Ginger the Voice on your doorstep. Once again, it's a Wednesday evening, and we are truly in springtime now. It's a bit warmer, not as cold as it was a few weeks back when spring or September started. It's Heritage Month once again. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We'll just give it another 10 seconds to allow you to come through. Please do like our video as you watch us. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are so excited to be here once again. Thank you, Mbu. We can see you, Akko. We can see you, Timbi, as well. We are grateful that you are here, that you are watching. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, Viswineba. We can see you there waving at us again. We will not waste much time. We will get into the conversation. Just give it 2 more seconds to allow our viewers to come through. We do note that today we were 5 minutes late, but thank you so much for waiting for us. We truly appreciate this. Ginger the Voice says thank you to all as you watch us tonight. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's time that we start. Anyone coming in late will join the wagon. Welcome to Ginger the Voice. My name is Ginger, the founder of Ginger the Voice. We're a company that seeks to give enlightenment, courage, hope, and we do this through different and various platforms such as MC, speaking, singing, and also hosting talk shows. So tonight we are talking about heritage and culture in the African context and why it's important for us to preserve and protect it. It's Heritage Month, as we know, we're celebrating it, and tomorrow is the Heritage Day, the officially set aside day and acknowledged by also our government for us to acknowledge and to observe our uniqueness as Africans, our uniqueness as South Africans, Africans with 11 languages, and those are just the official languages, which is part of our heritage and part of our culture. We also embrace the different cultures that we have in our country, and this is a time where we need to get to know who we are and get our identity and sit on the table and be the voice of Africa. This is a time where we need to learn more about ourselves, who we are, where we're from, and therefore where we are going. So tonight we've got exciting guests with us. We're so excited that we've got them together to sit and hold this conversation. They've got in-depth knowledge in what they are talking about. We've got in our midst Dr. Jongi Klaas. We also have Anthony Lister. If you could just wave to the viewers tonight. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming through. Thank you so much for making it today so that we can hold this conversation with you tonight. We will want to start with you, Dr. Jongi Klaas. Maybe you can quickly just give us, who is Dr. Jongi Klaas? Just 2 seconds before we hit the ground running so that our viewers may understand who they are conversating with tonight.
The alumnus of the University of Fort Hare. I did my BPed at Fort Hare, majoring in English, History and Education. I then was lucky to be a Fulbright scholar in the United States of America, doing my master's in curriculum. After that, then I proceeded to the University of Cambridge as a Mandela Scholar to study PhD in sociology. I lectured at Rose, I joined the government, published a book, Memoirs of Relentless Pursuit. I'm currently working on a history project entitled The Tragedy of a Distorted History. Thank you, Ginger, and your listeners.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Klaas. Welcome to you too, Anthony Lister. Thank you so much for coming through. I just recently heard that you actually grew up in Alice, and that's where I grew up as well, where there is the University of Fort Hare. So it's also exciting to know that there's a bit of connection with our speakers tonight. Welcome, Anthony. Can you just introduce yourself? Tell us just with 5 seconds, who are we going to be conversing with tonight?
Okay, thanks, Ginger. Yeah, actually, it was my dad who grew up in Alice, but I spent a lot of time there as a child. I grew up in Cape Town. I did, like Dr. Klaas, although mine was a GCT, a BA in English and History, and then a teaching diploma afterwards. I taught for 7 years, then 20 years in the business world in human resource management, and then 14 years ago back into teaching, mainly history. Since coming back, I was head of history department at Sea Point High School, which is an interesting school, former Model C, but now 98% isiXhosa speaking children. And then for the last 7 years back at SAX. SAX is the oldest high school in South Africa. It is a state school, but it's a traditional all boys school. It also has a very strong libertarian tradition. And for 7 years, I was chief marker for the matric history paper for the Western Cape.
Okay, I just love how you just said isiXhosa pupils, meaning
that about all I can.
It's not Tswana, it's isiXhosa and Setswana. So we will not waste much time. Dr. Klaas, please take us through what is heritage and what's it all about, the identity of, in the African context, obviously talking about the aspect of our economy in the African context, our religious matters as well. Can you just take us through that for a few seconds?
All right, thank you. Ginger, for this. When you talk about heritage, heritage is centered on 4 fundamental pillars of culture, history, language, identity, and land. So those are the 5 pillars of heritage. And the way I look at it in the context of the African continent, I would present Ethiopia as a typical example which actually illustrates heritage in relation to history, culture, language, identity, and land. The Ethiopians, they can trace their heritage 3,000 years back at the time of the Queen of Sheba, who happened to have a son with King Solomon of Jerusalem of the biblical times. The birth of that son, in terms of their history, it actually marked the beginning of a Solomonic dynasty, which ruled Ethiopia for over 300 years. until the assassination of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. The Ethiopians will tell you about the heroic acts of Emperor Menelik II, who defeated Italy in the Battle of Adwa in 1892. That is their history.
Okay.
For the past 3,000 years, they have maintained their original Amharic language. It's a unique language. When you look at it, you may think that it's Arabic. That language has been there for the past 3,000 years in Ethiopia. It's part of their heritage, which is in terms of history and language. They pride themselves on their traditional food. They call it injera. It's also look like bread. It's made up of the local product of grain in Ethiopia. They've got a unique regalia of exotic colors made with unique local material. They have their legendary flag of the green, yellow, red colors. And those colors are used by most of the African continent in their flags. We also use part of those colors in our flags. The Ethiopians cherish their land, their mountains and rivers. They are proud about their rich and unique heritage because they can say when they talk about the heritage, they will tell you about their language, their culture, their identity, their land, that they can go back. Unfortunately, the situation in different parts of this continent is different than Ethiopia. The painful reality of our history in the past 400 years is that we were conquered, dispossessed, dehumanized, enslaved, and commodified. Our history, our identity, and our culture were uprooted and eradicated. Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer, puts it so well. He says, they put a knife on the things that held us together, and we're falling apart. On the same note, Bishop Sigribo Duane laments about the abuse of religion in the eradication of our heritage. He says, the post-missionary Christianity in Africa, with its links with colonialism, capitalism, and the abstract proclamation of the gospel, has created a deep cultural confusion and left a permanent scar on the souls of the African people. Being that as it may, where are we now in relation to heritage and identity in the African context of economy, anthropological, and religious matters? In terms of our heritage in relation to history, culture, language, identity, and land, unfortunately, if you read, I did history at high school, university, and up to History 3 at Forte. 95% of that history, it projects us as Africans as people who were uncivilized, with no capacity to think and to rationalize. Yet we have heroes and great history of Mapungubwe, the cradle of humankind, the paintings of the Congo caves, etc. In terms of our language, most of it is no longer taught in urban schools. The Black middle class would take pride when their children cannot speak the African language, saying my child can only speak English. Our language is dying in front of us, and we're doing nothing about it. My fear is that even the coming generations after us may even battle to get hold of or traces of the written language. In terms of culture, we are ashamed of who we are. We are ashamed of our skin. We are ashamed of our short hair. We worship foreign cultures. And even if you hear the slang, for example, in the African context, people talking about yellow bone, If people will begin to cherish and worship and appreciate Werebone, that is tantamount to self-hatred.
Mm.
You get a sense of people who don't appreciate their looks and the essence of who we are, but they worship these foreign idols. Then what is the way forward? Having said all these things, what is the solution? How do we really begin to trace our history, our language, our identity, and come together as people? I think the moment has arrived in this generation that we should start to celebrate the symbols of African heritage in the following ways. I think it's important to review and rewrite our curriculum, especially in the area of history. I'll make one example. If you read, for example, the arrival of the Europeans in South Africa in 1652, you read that history of 300 years. It's a history of conquerors. It's a history of people who did good things to come and civilize the country and liberate the people. But what you don't often get in that history is the role that was played by our forebears, our ancestors, in that struggle of resistance. You take, for example, if you read, there's a battle of 1811. This battle was fought around, they call it the Fourth Frontier War. Was fought in a place they used to call it at the time as the Zoeveld. It's between Port Elizabeth and King Williamstown on the coast. There are two versions of that battle. If you read the dominant version, it tells you that at the time of Governor Lieutenant General John Cradock, who was the governor of the Cape Colony at the time, he realized that the Amaxhosa were occupying that place and destabilizing the local farmers who were there. It starts from that. And therefore, Governor Cradock deemed it necessary to assign Lieutenant Colonel Graham to push Amaxhosa out of that area. And if you read that history, it tells you how barbaric Amaxhosa were and how good Colonel Graham was in terms of clearing Amaxhosa, pushing them up to the Kai River, and then establishing civilization, building Grahamstown, bringing the farms and all that. But the second version of that same history, it doesn't tell you the heroic role that was played by Chief Ndlambe in 1811, who was the original occupant of that area between Port Elizabeth and Grahamstown. Upon learning that Colonel Graham was going to declare a war, the interesting part about this, you only read this history later, written by Mostert and Stapleton. What you realize there was that Ndlambe was a military strategist. He knew that they were going to be evicted there. He came up with a military plan. He assembled his troops. And then if you look at the battle plan that was drawn by Lieutenant Colonel John Graham, he was going to attack on a pre-Tron strategy. He decided to send Anders Stockenstrom towards the north around Fort Beaufort. And then he sent Lieutenant Colonel Kyler to attack Ndlambe from the coast, moving to Ndlambe's headquarters. And then Colonel Graham was going to be up behind to clear all Amaxhosa running away from these two battles. But what the history doesn't tell you was that Ndlambe sent Chief Klaas of Amambalu to take care of Anders, and Anders was defeated. And then Ndlambe decided to assemble his entire army to face Kyler. Kyler was defeated. And then Lieutenant Colonel Graham came to the assistance of Kyler. They still could not defeat Ndlambe. You know what actually happened? The defeat of Colonel Graham and Kyler and Anders by Ndlambe marked the birth of what they call scorched earth policy. Colonel Graham resorted to a scorched earth policy, destroying everything in that area, burning the villages, burning the crops, confiscating the cows, capturing women and children. And that became so devastating for Amaxhosa because they were not used to that kind of a battle. For them, a battle was just to defeat the enemy and absorb the enemy. But this sort of battle that destroys everything, it really took them by surprise. After he did that, then the British settlers then were brought in a place called now Grahamstown in honor of Colonel Graham. The history says that the use of the Scotch Earth policy became a permanent feature of the British wars fought in Southern Africa, as far as Botswana and other parts of the continent. But all I'm trying to say, I'm trying to give you...
Yeah, just to interject quickly there, Dr. Klaas, thank you so much for that rich history. What I would like us to just go back a bit in your introduction. You spoke about the Ethiopians owning and embracing their regalia, you know, and that's part of our heritage, that's part of our culture as Africans. You know, what do you have to say with the situation that we're faced with now, particularly here in South Africa, maybe in other parts of Africa as well, where you find that now within our economy, we get other people from other nations owning our own regalia and selling it, manufacturing it and selling it back to us. You find, for instance, here in Johannesburg, I don't know in other cities, but here in Johannesburg, you find that there are many now, sorry to put it this way, but Chinese shops that actually make our own cultural regalia and they sell it back to us. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, I would go to Mama so-and-so in Soweto and she would sell it to me. You know, Mama so-and-so in Tembisa, she would manufacture it and make it and sell it to me. How is that, what are we doing as South Africans in order to preserve our own heritage and culture in terms of our regalia, manufacturing it, and also to impact positively in the economy, local economy?
I hear you, but I think what we need to do as South Africans is three things. Charity begins at home.
Yes.
We need, one, to review our curriculum so that we change the way we think, we change the way our children think. That is the first thing, before you come to these bigger issues. Number two, we need to make sure that the African languages are taught in urban schools. We can't blame anyone for that. It's our responsibility to make sure that it actually happens. Three, we need to go through a process of what you call self-consciousness, self-reflection about us. That we have to go through a sense of collective soul-searching exercise. And we need to admit that we're also complicit in this. We cannot always blame other people for this, to say others are too, because other people who came, they take opportunities that we don't take. They come and work hard, and we don't want to work hard. So all I'm trying to say, all what it requires is a self-introspective exercise. And we need to come together collectively as a nation to say, we're not doing things right. How do we rectify these things? But I think most importantly, we need to do that without antagonizing what you call foreigners. Because even us, we were once foreigners in other countries. I was in diaspora in Ethiopia for 4 years. Ethiopians are lovely people. I went and worked in New York. I was treated so well. I studied my master's in Oklahoma. I was treated so well. I did my PhD in Britain. I was treated so well. So we can't run away from the fact that the world that we live in now is very integrated. Therefore, if we need to advance our cause, first things first, we get the basics right. My last point, Ginger, is that there's a game called Rugby. Rugby, you only win if you do the basics right. So even us, probably as the African people, we need to do the basics right. We need to self-respect ourselves, to respect other people, to work together as a nation, and to understand and admit that things are just not doing right. My last point here is that even at families, I've got 3 boys here in my house. I'm raising them based on 3 principles of love, fairness, and justice. And I believe that if I'm raising these boys to become better people in this society, I must love them. They must know what love is as their father. But secondly, I must teach them fairness, that whatever they do, they must be fair to other people. They must think about other people, whatever they do. 3, they must know that if they do something wrong, there are consequences. Justice has to be done. So all I'm trying to say, Ginger, it must start at families first. at communities, and then we build this nation.
Okay. So charity begins at home. We need to start schooling our children and helping them to acknowledge and love themselves as they are. Appreciating, you spoke about language, appreciating their own native languages. And it's up to us to take that responsibility as parents to enforce that kind of identity within our children's lives. Okay, coming to you, Anthony, as a historian. You've been a historian for the past 17 years. I want us to talk about also cultural property, preserving cultural property, because our heritage and our culture also revolves around the museums that we see, the artifacts that we see as well. So what is cultural property? If you could just take us through that.
Okay, cultural property, look, I think we have, before we even get into that, I think we have to acknowledge that heritage and culture are very controversial issues in our country.
Absolutely.
I like to start from the standpoint, and this is how I present it in my classroom, that we are all South Africans. Yes, we have differences in the way we've developed or in our background, but we have a common cause now, particularly since 1994, following the lead of amazing people like Nelson Mandela. And if you look at the efforts of his first government and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for all its flaws and the criticisms of it, it was designed to create a new South Africa where we can all join in. And that means for me that the cultural property, whatever it be, whether it be literature, whether it be music, whether it be artifacts, whether it be architecture, of all the cultures is important to preserve. Because of the way our country is developed, and Dr. Klaas was talking about this, by and large, that which has been preserved is the heritage and culture of the white part of South Africa, and particularly of white English and Afrikaans-speaking people. But there are large chunks of our white communities, even whose contribution is largely ignored. For example, Greek people, Portuguese people, and so on. And I think part of what we need to be doing is bringing everybody together. I'm shattered and horrified to hear what Dr. Klaas says about many Black people being proud that their children don't speak their own African language. One of my greatest is that I grew up speaking only English and Afrikaans. And therefore I'm excluded. I grew up in the Cape, as you heard. I'm excluded in a sense from communicating more effectively with the majority of the population of my province. The schools at which I have taught have all, even in the 80s, when I was at SACS, we were teaching isiXhosa to our white boys, which is, by contrast, it's a weird irony, I think, Dr. Klaas. You're saying on the one hand, many Black people are saying we don't want our children to learn their languages, and on the other hand, you have a whole lot of people who are trying desperately to learn it. I'm also amazed, and I'm not arguing with you, I'm just sort of responding almost emotionally, that some of the things you were talking about people not buying into their own African heritage remind me with horror of things like, I think it was called Imvo, the skin lightener that was around in the early 60s. And all over the show, there were advertisements showing Black people straightening their hair and using skin lightening creams in an attempt to be more acceptable in society. And I'm really sad that has continued. I understand to an extent why it has. In terms of cultural property, I made a number of notes. I think, yes, we have to acknowledge that we have a multicultural society. For me, that means that all the sections of society need their heritage protected. And I've already qualified that by saying there has been an imbalance in the protection of some groups and areas, not others. And I'm really pleased, Dr. Klaas, you spoke of Ethiopia. At the South African Society of History Teachers Conference last year, I heard a paper, which I think was based in Ethiopia, where they've recontextualized a whole lot of statues and colonial type era memorials to better represent how they fit into the sort of duality of history that you were talking about. Ethiopia is one of the two places in Africa that has never been colonized properly. Ethiopia being one and Liberia being the other. Liberia's got a different history. So it's really wonderful to have that as a sort of model almost of what could be, and for us to learn from. I I'm in awe of some of the efforts that have been made over the years, quite often at the cost of enormous cost to people in all sorts of ways, particularly under apartheid. I think, for example, of the Andrew Tracy music collection at Rhodes, which set out to try to preserve indigenous African music. However flawed the processes might have been, there has at least been that sort of attempt. That I agree, so we need to expand dramatically. The history curriculum, I couldn't agree more. It has changed a lot since I was at school, where I learned about the Great Trek every year from grade 1 through to matric. We do now look at, for example, the history of Mali and the process of Mali becoming a huge leader in trade and commerce and power and technology. And we look at the first university in the world at Timbuktu. So there is an element of that that's come in. It perhaps hasn't gone far enough, but that is being embedded in the curriculum and the modern history textbooks. And there is currently a huge review of the history curriculum underway at national government level. I think also, for me, whilst wanting to preserve things that already exist, but recontextualizing them, I think we need to be putting a whole lot more energy and effort into preserving things from other cultures that have historically been ignored. Some of that is quite difficult because there is a limited, in my knowledge, okay, a limited amount of written material. It's only really in the 20th century that we get much written material from many of the African cultural backgrounds. But what we need to be doing is preserving the stories, the oral tradition. We need to be interviewing people. We need to be going into Sutterheim and Alice, and I'm thinking obviously out of my experience, and interviewing the old people in the homesteads, in the countryside, and saying, what do you remember? What did your grandfather, what did your grandmother tell you? What did she say about her grandmother? How did they live? It may not necessarily be as accurate as a written word, but then we can at least preserve the form, the basis, the majority of that heritage, and we can then start to disseminate it. And that can be fed into institutions like museums, it can be fed into film, it can be fed into theatre. And I know, for example, Artscape in Cape Town is doing quite a lot of work on this sort of theme, particularly with the Cape communities, but much more needs to happen. I think also it's important that we don't ignore what has gone before. I think we do that at our one example I always like to quote, and I use it to my boys quite frequently, is the Apartheid Museum here in Johannesburg, which doesn't set out to, it does the opposite. It throws the apartheid horrors straight into our faces, but it puts them into a context and says, this is what happened. And I have to tell you, the first time I visited, I was there for about 3 hours and I was in tears the whole time. But we need to do that so that we don't forget and therefore we don't repeat. It's like similarly with what a lot of what's happened in Germany, with places like Auschwitz, Poland and Germany and places like that. So recordings, institutions like the Apartheid Museum, artifacts in museums need to be completely representative of all the cultures of our society, and they've got to be presented in a way that is respectful and appropriate to that organization, that culture, that background. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a huge fuss in Cape Town because there were diorama displays of Khoi and San and various other African, or let's use the word black, groupings, anthropologically appropriate, anthropologically sound. But the issue was that they were in the South African Museum, the majority of which is exhibits were animals and insects and birds and snakes. And that was entirely inappropriate, okay? Because again, it continues that myth of African people, black people as being inferior, the sort of things, they had no culture, they're barbarians, they're savages, which is absolute nonsense. The cultures they had, the technologies they had were appropriate to how they had developed. So we need to celebrate that. So moving that sort of display into a display area, like for example, what was the South African Cultural History Museum, the Slave Lodge, where there were other displays of other elements of Cape life, Malay life, white Afrikaner life, white English life. If you put all those together, then for me, it makes a great deal more sense. And certainly the insulting process of having Khoi and San people in the same sort of area as animals is completely abhorrent. We need to display people as all human and all equal and all valuable. And so we need to continue the process of capturing music. Yes, there's going to be an integration. There's going to be a mixing. There has been some progress. It's not nearly enough. One of the things that impressed me when I was here in Johannesburg last year about this time, I visited the military museum in Saxonwold. And traditionally that had been all white soldiers with one or two little paintings by Neville Lewis of people like Job Msek from the Second World War. But now there's a huge display dedicated to MK and MK's role and other APLA's role and other freedom fighters in that conflict. So it's portraying both sides of the story, which I think is the route we have to go along. Obviously, promoting the use of every culture, as I've talked about in art, in literature, in music, in theatre, not at the expense of getting rid of what is good in other cultures, but perhaps promoting those areas which have been underutilized and underpromoted. So we need to be actively seeking out artifacts and preserving them. We need to be doing things like not just making a tourist issue out of Gold Reef City or out of Soweto tours. Yes, it's important that people go to Soweto, but it's important that they see everything in Soweto, not just the rather sanitized bit that is shown to rich Western tourists. The Zulu villages in KZN, which I haven't visited for years. This is me speaking perhaps emotionally, but I often wonder what the people who are performing their traditional dances in those villages feel. Are they doing it to preserve their heritage, or are they doing it purely because it pays them a wage? Do they feel demeaned by almost being looked at like people in a zoo? That's the sort of thought process I have in my mind as to the value of those things. I'm not making a judgment. I'm saying that's how the debate I have in my mind. Dr. Klaas talks about Mapungubwe, and absolutely amazing, cradle of humankind. It's a beginning, but we need far more state and private resources poured into all these things.
Okay.
Does that make some kind of sense?
It does, absolutely does. What I also want to understand from both of you, Dr. Klaas and Anthony, is when the popular phrase, I am African is said, what does that mean? You know, what is the African identity? How can you break that down and define it for us? What is the African identity? I'm white, I'm here, and I say I'm African. What am I saying? You know, I'm black, I'm colored, I'm Indian. I'm saying I am an African. What identity does that bring?
Maybe in my case, I had a discussion yesterday in another different setting. One lady says there, the problem of saying you're an African in her context is always viewed in a negative way as being anti-white, anti-civilization, anti-current establishment. And in essence, there's nothing wrong being an African. If you remember also our former president, Thabo Mbeki, when he delivered that famous speech as an African. For me, it was one of the most powerful speeches I've ever listened to. But coming back to your question, in myself, I always identify myself as an African based on these 4 pillars of history, culture, identity, and land. I think for me, those are the 4 pillars that actually characterize me as an African. When I talk about history, I'm saying I'm an African because I've got history. I've got forebears who fought for me, who fought for this continent. I've got people who were the best of the best in whatever they did at the time. And when you talk about culture, I said to myself, I've got a culture that has given me value system, a culture that has given me dignity, a culture that has given me hope and courage, a culture that has made me to be so courageous about my future. There's a book I read written by A.C. Jordan, The Wrath of the Ancestors. There's a line there in terms of our culture. He says, Ngabane was a typical man of his time. That if you tell him something diabolic or scary, he will behave like a man of his time, not showing you that he was hurt. But yet Ngabane had a deep sense of who he was. Again, if I define myself as an African, I think about the poem written by J.P. Solilo, Mthandi Wesizwe. There's a line where he says in isiXhosa, ngubani umabhongo ngelakhe ikamva, ngubani onegugu izinto zakowabo, ngohlala elinde ukubona into ezintle, othemba linzulu noxa kungekuhle. Basically, what he's talking about there, Solilo, is talking about a sense of a person who's got hope in a hopeless situation. A person who's always selfless to help his or her countrymen. And a person who's hopeful about the future that lies ahead. Thirdly, I identify myself as an African in terms of my identity. That I know who I am, where I come from, and I'm proud of that. Not in a negative way, but in the essence of who I am. And I remember when I was studying abroad, I missed my language, isiXhosa. I got tired of speaking English. And I remember in my voice note, we had phones at that time where you have the voice note. In my voice note was bilingual. If you call me, if you don't find me, the voice note will say, "Kumsuthu lo andikho, shimyalezo ndawubuyela kuwe." Then I'll say, "This is John, leave your message, I'll call you back." And I'll never forget Professor Terry McLaughlin, who taught me at the University of Cambridge. He says, "Jongi, I love listening to your voice note. It's so beautiful. I like that flow of language." But again, it's a sense of my identity, my culture, and my heritage. That's how I define myself as an African.
Okay, over to you, Anthony. When you say I'm an African, as a white person, what does that mean? Yes.
For me, it means that I and my family for several hundred years, I have been part of Africa. I was born here. I know it might sound as if I wasn't, maar ek is heeltemal tweetalig. Ek is Grappenaar, ek is gebore. Yeah, unfortunately, those are the only two languages I speak. I have a variety of European countries in my background. I also have Khoi ancestry. So I'm sort of linked in with the first people, which is rather exciting for me as a white person. It's wonderful to be able to claim that. And I know I'm making a joke of it, but it is important that people like me, whose background, largely speaking, has been from a European perspective, that we accept that we are part of something, we are not the whole, which has happened historically for far too long. And that's how my parents brought me up. They said, "You're an African, you are part of a much greater whole. There are all sorts of different pieces. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, and some of the pieces are green, and some are purple, and some are blue, and some are yellow. I'm deliberately avoiding racial stereotype of skin tones. But put together, they all make this beautiful whole. And so you've got to appreciate different cultures, different traditions, and not deny your own heritage and background, but acknowledge where it has failed, where its faults are. And I say this to my boys at school, we have a whole lot of traditions in the school, very traditional school. And if some traditions are bad or harmful, like bullying, they've got to go. So if there are elements of my background or my culture which are harmful to other people, then I must cut myself off from them. I'm not one of the sort of people, English-speaking people, who thinks of England as home. I never have, okay? I was born here, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, at least, if not further back. And I also relate very strongly to what Dr. Klaas is saying about the dignity and the strength and courage that has come from my forebears. It's come in a different way from his, but it's still there. And I think there are many, many South Africans, when we actually talk at this sort of level, will find that whatever the apparent surface differences are, We share similar ideals, similar values, similar desires and needs. And it's when we can start talking to each other as opposed to past each other or down to each other, or as in the past, from one group up to the other, that we can forge for all of us what I look forward to as a truly South African identity in Africa. I mean, if you look at some of the early African writers, the Africanist writers, Fanon and people like that, they were very clear that it was for Black people only. I deny that, because I think, going back to what you were saying, so about we're in a much more global community. Mm-hmm. I deny our place in the world globally. I identify as African and South African. I'm not English. I'm not British. I do wear my kilt from time to time, my traditional dress from my family, but I do it in the context of Africa. Okay. I'm not whizzing off to Scotland to live there. I'm African. My children were brought up here. I've been brought up here. I've given most of my life in service to education in various ways in this country, because partly I want to make the country a better place. And it's not, there have been struggles at times. My family was active in white opposition politics in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And although our suffering was not anything at all compared with that of so many people in the struggle in various other ways, but there were negative effects. My father was denied his permanent appointment as a teacher in a government school because one of the boys in his history class was the son of a National Party senator who reported back on the way my father was teaching history. Very small by comparison with the sacrifices of people like Steve Biko. But it does give me a feeling of having been part of the change to a limited extent, insofar as we could be. So for me,
Dr. Absolutely. Dr. Johnny Klaas, going back to what you were saying before, you were saying that we need to be the voice of our African society, not let other foreigners or people from other countries to come and tell us who we are. Because for a very long time, we have been, I would say, for lack of a better word, we've been the props of your maybe first world countries for a very long time. They are the ones who've been telling our story. And now it's time that we tell our story the way that it is. So you were talking about infusing into our curriculum, school curriculum, the history, the South African history, or the African history. You spoke of Ndlambe, etc., and other great warriors of amaXhosa. Which authors and maybe readings that you can suggest that people should consider so that we can clarify this cultural identity?
There is a book written by Mostert. I'm not sure where is it here. It's written by Null Mostert. It says the epic story of amaXhosa, the great treasure. But if you just go and check Null Mostert, it's got a very interesting book, but it's very thick. It's about 1,600 pages.
Okay.
There is a book written also by another Canadian, Dr. Tim Stapleton, about Maqoma. And you remember that if you read earlier authors like Perez, J.P. Perez, who wrote The House of Palo, who wrote Unonause. Then if you read Stapleton, he differs with Perez in the characterization of Maqoma, which is very interesting. And so therefore is the work of these contemporary authors whom I believe that can actually help us to understand where we come from. There is a book, but it's difficult to find these days. It was written by one of the Soga brothers in the beginning of 1900. But also the history of amaXhosa. And I believe that there is that now journey where we're beginning to rewrite that history, to revisit it, and go back to the primary sources to make sense out of that history.
Okay, all right. Anthony, you are talking about cultural property and preserving it. Okay, what I wanted to also understand from you, why is it so important to preserve cultural property? What value does it play in our society?
It plays a value in giving us a context of where we come from. It plays a value in giving us items, practices, traditions, cultures, music, songs, writings, poetry, stories, place us in a context of where we have come from. And they allow us to celebrate what has happened before, which has made us, but both Dr. Klaas and I have referred to that, sort of made us who we are, the dignity we have, the things we revere, the teachings we've had from, and in white and black culture, ancestors or forebears are important. Okay, they have different roles, but they're both important. And they've left stuff for us. If we don't know about them, okay, we can't all, the general population can't go and read the academic books that perhaps the three of us have read. It just isn't in their life. But they can go to a museum and they can see, for example, perhaps the shield that Sandili used, okay, or Makoma. I apologize for my pronunciation, which, yeah, exactly, okay. Or they can see, sadly, a torture instrument that was used in a police cell in the 1980s, like the Apartheid Museum. Or they can see implements used by gold miners, or differing levels of safety equipment provided for white and black miners, which speaks to the economic, what's the word I'm looking for? Exploitation. So if we don't preserve these things, both the good and the bad, going back to what I said earlier, how will our children know what has gone before? If we don't have things to show them, particularly people who don't have the freedom, in whatever sense, to do extensive reading. They're too busy. They're trying to make a living. They're keeping families alive, particularly in this sort of economy. If we don't have places to take them to, stuff to show them, music for them to hear, then it's very easy for the sort of situation that Dr. Klaas is talking about to happen. They lose connection with what has gone before. And they become immersed in a much more globalized, modern globalized environment, which for me, sadly, has become very narrow, very commercialized, very brand driven. There's nothing wrong with brands, don't get me wrong. It's very focused, very monetary focused, that's not the word I want, materially focused. And we begin to lose, and our children begin to lose the spiritual and psychological backgrounds from which we all come and which we need to be sharing with each other. So that's for me why it's absolutely vital that all these things be preserved in appropriate ways, appropriately contextualized, okay? And there has, as I said earlier, little work has been done, not nearly enough yet. But otherwise we lose our past. And our past is who we are.
Sure. Dr. Klaas, just as we're about to close, you alluded to religion being used as a weapon at some point to take from us. And you're talking about spiritual matters as well, Anthony. So what are you saying in actual? Are you saying that as Africans, we didn't have a religion? As Africans, we just lived on our own and did as the spiritual aspect of it was not really there? What is it that we should have taken from, or should we take from the colonizers and explorers who took from us using religion? So what should we then follow suit in their religion? Should we not? What are you actually saying about Africa and religion in terms of heritage?
What happened traditionally with, and it's not just the English, it was with most colonizers. It happened in South America with the Roman Catholic Church. It's happened all over the world. Where colonizers from Europe have colonized, they have generally imposed their religion along with their cultural systems and their governance systems and all those things onto the lands that they have conquered. There were religions in all these places. There were spiritual practices, there were spiritual beliefs. There's ample evidence in all these cultural things. Dr. Klaas talked about Mapungubwe, we talked about Kango caves. There's a lot of rock art which shows religious practices, religious ceremonies. They were different from what the Europeans brought in. Europeans came from a very narrow, very, very narrow interpretation of Christianity. It is the only religion, therefore you've got to do it. And it was imposed like all the other things. and many of the, as far as I'm aware, many of the so-called black churches, I don't even know how to categorize them. I know Francis Wilson did a lot of work on them in the 70s. The various different kinds of groupings outside the mainstream denominations have assimilated elements of Christianity with elements of traditional African religions, which has created for many people a much more comfortable and acceptable religious home in a modern society. But we can't get away from the fact that colonizers imposed their religion and attempted to stamp out the other religions which were seen as of the evil one.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what should happen. Certainly, I don't believe that. And I think that makes it quite difficult for a person, a black person. It's much easier for me because that's part of my line of heritage, the practices of English-speaking churches, for example. I'm an Anglican.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult for a black person who has the conflict between what he or she has been taught in terms of the role of ancestors, of the role of traditional healers, all those things, contrasting that. And I think many of the mainline churches are moving, they're moving perhaps too slowly, but moving towards a greater acceptance of alternative forms of expression of worship. Again, as with most things, perhaps it's moving too slowly for many people, but historically, that is what happened. Colonizers attempted to eradicate local religions.
Okay. What do you have to say about this, Dr. J.J. Klaas?
I think for me, in short, in addition to what Anthony said, without repeating what he said, I think for me, the bone of contention centered around the interpretation of the religion. I do believe that religion is a universal phenomenon.
Absolutely.
We may have the same God that we call him in different ways, but at the same time, it's the same God. But if you look at how then, as I quoted earlier on, the issue of the statement from Bishop Sikributwane, what he laments about was the manner in which this religion was brought with the sole purpose of eradicating our own identity, our own culture, our own sense of belief, our respect to our own cultural values. What is lamentable about the religion that was brought is the fact that even look at the images, how it portrays Jesus Christ, his images. Jesus Christ was not from Europe, but it portrays him as a European man with that face. It doesn't portray him as someone from the Middle East and Palestine or that part of the religion. So you can see that there was something very deep and systematic in the manner in which this religion was brought. They may have not so in the process then we lost our identity, our culture, our history. Take, for example, the Israelites. When they talk, they said the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So what is wrong with us if we say the God of King Palo, the God of Chachabe, the God of Ndlambe? So if you say that, some people say, oh, this is appalling. Now we are beginning to worship the ancestors. But all I'm trying to say that if we can begin to reinterpret religion in our own understanding, in our own way of looking at things, for me, that would be the best way to go. As I said, that the bone of contention centered around interpretation.
Okay. As a last round, as a closing remarks, starting from you, Anthony, what do you have to say to South Africans in terms of us preserving our African culture and acknowledging who we are and putting ourselves first and loving ourselves? And also you alluded to, Steve, because Black consciousness of understanding and knowing that we are enough as Africans, therefore we can do it. What do you have to say?
I think you've said it actually for me. I think we have to acknowledge that we are enough, that we are not an inferior people, whatever our skin color. As South Africans, as Africans, we are amazing people. There are amazing things in our history on which we can build. I think going further, I think and it comes back into what you were asking a bit earlier, Ginger, about the artifacts and things being made nowadays by people who are not of African background. I think we need to buy local. We need to support local industry and commerce at whatever level. I was horrified some years ago when I took some school children. One of the things Nelson Mandela introduced was at the opening of Parliament was State of Nation address that as part of the Guard of Honor, they have school children to acknowledge the role of children in the country. And we took them and they were each given a T-shirt and a cap, Parliament representing Parliament. And those garments were made in India. And they were being given out by our Parliament. And I was just thinking, here we are trying to encourage our economy. We're trying to encourage entrepreneurs from all walks of South African life. We're trying to boost South Africa. And here is Parliament buying from India. And it's that sort of thing that I think we've got to get away from.
Okay.
We possibly can. We buy local, we support local people, we support local artists. Yeah, it's fine to support foreigners, but why not listen to local music? Why not listen to local artists? Why not go to local theatrical productions? Buy the sort of books that are coming out which re-examine our history and cultural practices. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay. Dr. J, as closing remarks, what do you have to say to the people of South Africa and the African continent at large with regards to us preserving our culture, preserving our heritage, and preserving it for the next generation as well?
My just 3 last points as closing points is to say, one, we need to go through a process of self-introspection, self-consciousness in relation to our identity and our culture. That is number one. Two, we need to review and rectify the tragedy of our distorted history so that we are able to draw hope and inspiration from it in order to deal with the present and be hopeful about the future. The last point is we need to embrace the essence of who we are and where we come from in this beautiful continent. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you so much, Dr. Klaas, for gracing us with your presence tonight. Viewers, you've heard it at home today that we need to preserve our culture, we need to preserve our heritage, we need to understand who we are, understand our identity, and pass it on to the next generation. And another thing that we need to take note on is that it's the African voices that must have a say in the way that we do things and talking to our history as well. So let's stand up, get out there, do things, and own this country and own this land because it is ours. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ginger and I'm the owner of Ginger the Voice. We're a company that seeks to give hope, courage, and enlightenment. We do this through various platforms such as speaking, singing, emceeing, and also having talk shows. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you and good night.